Communist bullies and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial. Joining me today is Garrick Ross. And of course, Christopher Hopkins, our assistant producer, and Adam Coutura, our producer. So, Mr. Millennial, how are you doing during this quarantine?
I'm bored.
Yes. Well, we're kind of quarantined, just so you guys know out there in podcast land, because yes, we are in the same room. However, we're along this really large table, and the table is, 10 feet plus long. So that way we can properly social distance during the podcast. So we're following all the rules, just to let you know, Governor.
And advocating that you do too.
Exactly. We're advocating that too. We're not saying that, you should put other people in danger or yourself in danger. However, we are hearing good comments about people saying, I'd like to go back to work because, maybe if I can get tested, I can go back to work, and who knows, maybe we can get the economy back started.
Yeah, I heard that too,
So the podcast is called Communist Bullies. And so Victor David Hanson, he's a Hoover scholar at the Hoover Institution. He's a fellow, which means he's a scholar at the Hoover Institution, which is embedded in Stanford University in California.
It's a national think tank as well.
It's a great think tank. And obviously I don't agree with everything that comes out of there, but here's the thing. They've got great lectures coming out of Hoover. And Victor David Hanson just has a way of talking about things that it's just very commonsensical.
Yeah.
And we have 3 clips from him in a recent interview. And Victor David Hanson is talking about China and what did they know and when did they know it. And I think this is really important because even though we've had, all of these different news reports and all the different channels, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and of course Fox News, what we've been seeing is not a lot of really thorough reporting about when did it actually happen? When did President Xi Jinping, when did he know about this crisis?
And what steps did he take?
What did he take? When did he tell the rest of the world?
Yeah.
And so those are the questions that were asked of Victor David Hanson. And here's the first one. He says, on January 23rd, President Xi locked down Wuhan on January 23rd. And we have a clip on this, and here it is.
I would add to his list, the key one for me is January 23rd, when he locked down all travel to and from Wuhan to every Chinese city in his country. And he was perfectly willing for people he thought were infected or could be infected that posed a danger to Chinese. He was perfectly willing to have them get on a direct flight to San Francisco or LAX or Bern or Paris. And he was also perfectly willing to unleash the Chinese military propaganda and Communist Party megaphones, who said that it was racist and homophobic to have a travel ban 7 days after he did.
So that's right. So President Xi had a travel ban within China, whereby if you lived in Wuhan, you could not travel outside of Wuhan. You were stuck in that city of 11 million people during the initial early days of the crisis and what later, of course, we found out to be a pandemic. And so President Xi didn't have a problem.
If you went to another country, though.
Yeah, you could go to another country from Wuhan. You could hop on a plane at the international airport to go to another country. But what you couldn't do is travel within China from Wuhan to Beijing, as an example. That was prohibited.
From what I understand, a lot of people did that. A lot of people went and, in Wuhan, they saw what was going on and they hopped on their first flight out and they went to places like, Washington State, California, but also places in Europe too. And it's probably how we got to where we are now.
There's no doubt about it. And the thing is, that timeline is really important because this goes to the fact that the president of China, Garrick, knew what was going on at a very early stage and decided to shut down. Look, this is hard. This is really hard to comprehend. So Wuhan is larger than New York City.
Yeah.
Okay, so New York City is the largest city in the United States. Wuhan's bigger than that.
Yes.
It has 11 million people in a really super concentrated area. 11 million people. I mean, imagine shutting something like that down because you're absolutely panicked as the president of China about what might happen. And you don't tell the rest of the world that there's a problem that's far greater than what you're letting on.
Yeah, that'd be incredible to try to pull off here in the United States. You made the comparison of Wuhan to New York City, and I think New York City clocks in just under that in size. But could you think of like the logistical operation that it would take in the United States to close down New York City, and how we would cover it on the news, and everybody would know what was going on, and people would be rightly concerned. And this was going on in China, and nobody knew.
And there's no transparency.
No.
That's the key. And I know we've talked about this whole transparency issue, but that's why communists are bullies, because they are by their very nature incentivized to not tell the truth ever to the people.
You can't even get on like the real Google in China, or you can't access YouTube and certain kinds of media outlets. Everything is kind of controlled, and information is disseminated to you forcefully, not openly. And a lot of the times, the information that we did get was from people who I would consider patriots, who saw what was going on within their city, and they recorded it, and they found unique ways to get it over to the United States. And other media outlets.
Exactly. And so Victor David Hansen is also asked the second question: what has China been doing since the pandemic?
We have no idea again.
What have they been doing? And here is the clip.
They didn't warn us. Their megaphone at the World Health Organization mouthed their platitudes and fooled people, and people died. But more importantly, what has China been doing? They had a propaganda campaign to blame us, even though we helped pay for that damn laboratory. And then they went right out to the Spratly Islands, South China Sea, and started renaming islands so that people during the panic would know that they're theirs. Then there were reports that they started to resume low yield or no yield nuclear testing, which is outlawed. And then they started cracking down on Hong Kong. And then there were stories that they were going to ignore international outcry about the re-education camps and maybe use Uyghurs to go out and do manual labor. So what they've shown empirically is that they're taking advantage of the crisis.
So the Chinese are the communists are taking advantage of the crisis because they're setting off low-level nukes. They're, of course, naming the Spratly Islands, giving them individual names so that they can basically claim them, which of course they've pretty much already done. In addition to that, there's been a lot of activity with the Chinese Navy in the
they dispatched their single
aircraft
carrier out into the Pacific Ocean to do patrols and maneuvers.
Exactly, and of course you've got the Uyghurs, which they use as basically slave labor, and so they're doing all of these. And of course, cracking down on Hong Kong. That's one of the critical ones, because there was everybody's forgotten that, right? There was a huge protest going on in Hong Kong for months and months, and now you don't hear anything about that now.
On the news, yeah.
And because you can only imagine what's happening with the Chinese communists and how they're bullying Hong Kong. And of course, bullying and projecting their power to all their neighbors, because I'm sure they feel a bit insecure.
Yeah.
They feel a bit insecure, and
they
also figure we're weak.
In their own right, slightly embarrassed as well. I mean, if you think about what the story that they've been peddling in the world has been, it's that, coronavirus wasn't from Wuhan or didn't start there. It was, some biological weapon that the United States came up with in in North Carolina, and somehow shipped over there and infected their people. But, we're talking about, communist bullies and things, and their system allows them to do this. Here in the United States, we put it in a...
Why does their system, from a millennial standpoint, why does the Chinese system allow the Chinese communists who rule, including Xi, of course, to be able to do pretty much whatever they want?
Because here in the West, and not even necessarily in the West, but you look at some of the other democratic states in the Asian region and the South Pacific, they're accountable to people, and there's an emphasis on caring for the health and safety of their population.
Sure.
Whereas in China, you can continue to force people to work. You can force them to take up arms and do military maneuvers.
You have a one-payer system.
You can
deny health care. You can deny life, liberty. You can deny free
force
speech.
the Uyghurs to work. You can force your military to oppress, protests in Hong Kong, and you can do this without ever caring for.
And all in the name of collectivism.
All in the name of collectivism and the greater good, because you're not accountable to anybody or anything. There is nothing that is a threat to your power other than your own idiocracy at times.
Yes, and you really don't have elections.
No.
That's the key. You're not accountable to the people.
There is no threat to your power. You're not
no
accountable
election.
to people. And if there is any kind of popular movement against you, you run it over like you did in Tiananmen Square 20 years ago.
And we'll talk about this in a little while, but we're seeing this in real time in North Korea, where there are some issues there, which we'll talk about in a bit. But of course, in China, when was the last time there was an election? There isn't. It's all bogus, right?
And when there are elections, it's local communists against local communists. I mean, there are some village level elections, but they're hand-chosen candidates and picked to go. I mean, it's
and
the
they
same
win
story.
every time.
Every
Imagine
time,
that.
and it's always unanimous. And things
So
like that.
third question to Victor David Hansen: why hasn't the media been more transparent? And just about the whole issue of transparency, which, by the way, is critical because it goes to how we got here today with the pandemic. There wasn't transparency from a communist country. What a surprise! But how about our own media? And they're being complicit as well. And we have a clip on this, and here it is.
And they haven't told us how many people have died or how many cases they've had. I think it's been the last 4 weeks. And we're stupid enough, the Western world, that when we look at Johns Hopkins or world meters, we list China there with this frozen figure. And then we go over and we look at deaths per million or deaths per cases, fatality per cases. And then these idiots get on cable news and say, we're not doing as well as China. China, how could they be doing? And it's like saying, wow, in 1939, Hitler's done a lot better job with the people who have mental problems or they have cerebral palsy because the hospitals are empty of them. Well, he killed them all.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's how President Xi solves problems, and Chinese communists, generally speaking, solve problems.
Yeah.
They basically lie, and just like they've lied during this pandemic, not just about how many coronavirus cases they have, but how many deaths there have been. And as Victor David Hansen said, Johns Hopkins, which is obviously considered one of the best hospitals in the world, located in Baltimore, Maryland, has been the repository for the global numbers of how many people per country have coronavirus, how many have passed away, how many have recovered. And of course, they're just taking whatever each country provides
reports,
them as being true. And I guess to be fair, maybe Johns Hopkins doesn't have a choice but to be able to collect that data the way it's submitted. But there should be an asterisk, don't you think?
Yeah, especially in
right
the
next
media.
To China?
If Johns Hopkins just publishes raw reported numbers, I understand. That's their prerogative, whatever they get, and they disseminate. But it's up to people out there in the media and people in think tanks like the gentleman we're talking about to make sure that there's an asterisk there and that people understand that, because of the nature of the Chinese regime, you can't take these things at face value and that you have to take them with a grain of salt. And it's imperative that everybody kind of gets on the same page and that we stop sitting here and squabbling over whether the United States is doing a good job relative to China, because quite frankly, we don't know what job China's done or how good it's been.
No, they're never going to tell us.
Exactly. And it's sitting here, and I get that it's for some in the media, it's about, dunking on the U.S. response because to some, this response has been inadequate or hasn't done enough.
And we don't have a free and fair media. You know what I'm curious about, Garrick, is with Millennials, and of course we have our assistant producer, Chris Hopkins here as well, who's also a millennial. But I'm just really curious with you guys, what do millennials really truly understand the difference in the way the Chinese people, the average person, has to live under communism, and how there's no transparency whatsoever in society, and you just kind of live from day to day, never really knowing whether your government's telling you the truth, what they're tracking. You can't really talk about things openly. You can't really complain about things that President Xi is doing.
I don't know that any of us truly understand or have a frame of reference because we're lucky. We happen to grow up in the greatest country, at least in my mind, that
So millennials still think that
democratic experiment that we could. I think I understand what you're saying, but the point that I think millennials would all agree is that we are lucky to be, and whether or not we disagree with everything that goes on, I think we all agree that this is a great place to be able to have these debates.
Do millennials understand?
Debates. No, I don't think any of us do because none of us have ever had to live in a communist regime. I think, we can all speculate, but until we've ever lived that life, it's easy for us to sit here and say, oh, well, they do this right or they do that wrong, and et cetera, et cetera. And then maybe this way of doing collectivization would be better implemented here under a democratic democratic regime and things like that. But I don't think that anybody in the United States who hasn't lived in a communist regime could competently sit here and say that they know what it's like.
Sure. Especially someone who, I mean, you wouldn't really know, of course, as an expat living in China or even Hong Kong unless you started using your cell phone to criticize the regime.
Yeah.
And then I would imagine bad things would happen.
Bad things, yes, absolutely.
Maybe at the very least you would be sent back home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you were sorry you can't come back here. We don't want you here anymore. You're not allowed to say any bad things
look what
about
China
the president.
did when this started coming out is they kicked out all the American and Western media. They told, the Wall Street Journal and all these places that you wouldn't even, consider. Like if they kicked out CNN and Fox News, I don't think there's people are going to run to their defense and say that they're like these great arbiters of justice and truth in the world. But when you start kicking out a lot of independent, media outlets, things, it kind of gives off this, what are you guys really hiding from? Like, what are you trying to avoid yourself of any criticism and that is detrimental to your regime's health and things like that?
We're talking about communist bullies in this podcast. That's the title of the podcast. And even China is being a bully to Australia.
Yeah.
Because Australia is hitting China on, they want information as to what did they know and when did they know it and what have they done about containment and what are they going to do moving forward to make sure this doesn't happen again.
They're fairly calling for and supporting any possibility of an investigation into the origins of the disease and what steps were taken and what weren't, so that we can hope to collectively avoid a future where this happens again. But China is quick to see that as a threat to their regime because it's not going to look good. It's not going to look good in retrospect, the steps that they didn't take and then how they react to everything and based on their,
So Australia, Garrick, has been warned by the Chinese ambassador, that it could face an economic hit if it does not back down from a push into the nation's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Ambassador Cheng Jingjie on Monday said the push was dangerous and could encourage Chinese citizens to not purchase Australian exports or travel to the nation. Quite frankly, Mr. Ambassador of China, I'm not really sure Australia wants more Chinese citizens traveling to Australia right now. So I don't think you have to worry about that problem. But this is interesting because this is classic bullying. It's like, no, we're not going to buy your stuff and we're not going to spend money in your country. We're not going to give you answers about how we've created this global depression. I mean, because that's all they're asking. That's all the Australian foreign minister, Marine Payne, he said the Australia rejects economic coercion threatened by China, which is a great response.
And this isn't an isolated incident from China. Australia isn't the first country that they've threatened. Just the other day, they threatened Canada for any intervention on our behalf as well in this international, arena. And I think it plays to the point that we should take a careful analysis of ourselves as well as our Western partners and just how economically dependent we are on China, and their manufacturing capacity and, their economic value. We've always played this game of total economic warfare with our adversaries, and it is a shame that we have been allowed to put ourselves in a place where we are so dependent on somebody who has been so hostile to us.
Yeah, well, you know what? I agree with you. And the thing is the Chinese always have, the Chinese communists always have difficulty being transparent. But communism in general is not a very transparent it's not a very transparent culture or political philosophy, nor is socialism, because as you know, communism is the highest level of socialism. In my mind, they're one and the same. I think that's the case with what most people think. But case in point, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is reportedly either really not doing well or potentially dead after botched heart surgery, allegedly. We don't know this, okay? So we have to be very careful. We're not really sure. But the thing is no one knows because there's no report coming out of North Korea.
No.
I mean, why is this hard? Why can't they just send out a press release saying, okay, the guy's not feeling too well, he's really ill, we don't really know what's going on, but we just want the rest of the world to know. And you might ask podcast listeners, why is this important? It's important because they have weapons of mass destruction that could annihilate the world. And since there's no transparency, we have no idea what's happening within this dark society. We have no idea what the power struggle could look like and whether the new person who takes over, assuming Kim Jong-un is dead or dying, we have no idea whether the new person might actually do a preemptive strike with nuclear weapons.
The running, power bets of who would likely take over would have been Kim's sister, who, from all intents and purposes, is much more dictatorial, authoritarian, much less compassionate, if that's even possible, than Kim is.
I think we should send Nancy Pelosi over there. Wouldn't she make a great leader of North Korea? My workers. Oh, workers of the world unite. I mean, she'd make a great communist dictator. I mean, she just would be perfect. Can you imagine?
That'd be quite interesting. I think it'd be a culture.
We just have to send the plastic surgeons over there.
They don't have a lot of ice cream over there, from what I understand. They don't get to enjoy
she'll
that.
find a way of getting it from China, I'm sure, because she kind of shares their philosophy.
But that's a great point, though. I mean, why this is so important is North Korea is effectively a puppet state of the Chinese Communist Party.
However, Kim Jong-un apparently hates President Xi because he wants, this is his country.
He wants legitimacy.
It's his country. He wants absolute power, which of course he does. And the last thing he wants is to have China have any leverage over his country. So there's a lot of tension there.
Well, without China, he has no economy because they're the only country that actually deals with him financially.
That are willing to give him,
so whether
sell him goods
whether
and
Kim
services.
in life liked it or not, he was effectively about as influenced as anybody could ever be by China.
I agree. No, it makes no sense. Look, here's, we're talking about, of course, communist bullies, but here's the takeaway. We are, without question in my mind, and we've mentioned this before in previous podcasts, in an economic war with China.
Yeah.
It's not a declared economic war, but it's an economic war.
It will be.
And part of the war has to do, with just something as simple as transparency.
Yeah.
The fact that moving forward, if China can't give us an account of what happened, and they're not willing to do that, honestly, then moving forward, we have no way of being assured that this isn't going to happen again.
Yeah, because think of a world where this happens again. They're talking about the possibility of a second wave of this until we're able to get a vaccine and things. Could you imagine a world where, this happens again in China and we go through the same motions again and again and China doesn't learn and that they're always going to, and it doesn't even have to be a disease. I mean,
sure.
Like think about the Chernobyl incident in the 80s and the 90s with, the Soviet
By
Union.
the way, that was a great series.
Great series, and it really gets you in about how, these types of regimes naturally lack transparency.
The apparatchiks, the more transparent you are, the more likely you're going to be taken in the back of a building and shot.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
You're encouraged not to be honest.
Scientist who was looking over the whole series, the series that they follow through, that protagonist, he winds up either killing himself or being killed by the Soviet Union out of sheer basically being bullied after this was over for his belief and transparency of what happened. So we prevent things like this from happening again, and we're going through the same motions again.
Well,
which is a different topic.
Of course, the guy in Chernobyl, he was marginalized because he was being honest.
Yeah, and open, talking about things.
Post Chernobyl, and then at the same time, I think they also denied him health care.
Yeah.
As I recall. It may also be possible that he didn't want health care as well, but he was just disgusted, of course, because all he wanted to do is try to keep the
from
country
happening
safe
again.
from it happening again.
And this is what we're saying. Like, you can go through these steps. Like, we're basically going through it again. It's not a nuclear incident. It's a biological incident, but it's always going to be the next incident, whatever it is. And when it does happen, you hope that it doesn't happen in a place like China or a communist Soviet Union where there's this lack of transparency. Look, Ebola happened. Ebola happened in a country where the United States was largely influential. We were largely able to go in and deal with it and see all the information as it happened, and we prevented essentially the next global pandemic years ago. And here we are again in a place where it's China. China is the epicenter. China is where this is all happening. And
what's frustrating? What's frustrating is after 9/11, we created the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration.
Yeah.
And we were forced, of course, to go through this huge screening process just in order to get into an airport and then ultimately board an airplane.
For rider safety.
And this is because of what people outside the country did to us. And created to our, literally changing our society forever. And now moving forward, we're going to have kind of a similar thing where we're basically going to say we're going to have to.
Yeah.
And I know what the left is going to say. They're going to say it's racist, but it's not racist. We're going to basically say, look, if you're boarding a plane from China and it's heading to the United States, we're going to need you to verify that you have been tested for not just coronavirus, but probably a whole list of viruses that could potentially infect our country moving forward. I mean, how else do we protect ourselves? I mean, I'm not saying permanently close down trade, permanently close down international travel, because that would be impossible.
Yeah.
But we at least have to have some reasonable assurance without having the Chinese communists be transparent. We have to have some assurance that those people on that plane aren't going to get off, and that's the next pandemic.
Well, let me ask you, Mark, can you trust that, these people who come over from China, that they are, that their forms and everything, like if, in this society, like in this, future you're talking about here, this inevitable change that we're going to have to face where we, seek to ensure our safety in a similar post 9/11 sense, are you going to be able to trust that, that this stuff that is created by the Chinese Communist Party?
Or
yeah, exactly.
Probably not. It's probably going to have to be some third
we're
country
going to be skeptical.
They probably would have to fly from China to some third party country that would receive them, whereby they would have to then get off the airplane, be tested, wait, then get back onto the airplanes, and that the testing would be done by Americans or some client of America that is reliable. See, this is what's fascinating, is the Chinese are literally digging. They're digging their own grave of their own regime without understanding that no one wants to do business with them moving forward if there's any issue of getting sick.
Yeah, and you talked about 9/11, and it wasn't just TSA. I mean, it was a whole culture change in how we approached surveillance and safety in the United States, and it's been that way for the next two generations. I mean, here we are,
and
20 years later, in surveillance, in the surveillance state that we live in, and things like that to ensure our security. I'm going to be increasingly intrigued by what similar responses happen over the next 20 years in light of this circumstance, which is, if not as serious as 9/11, much more exponentially serious.
I think the rest of this year is going to be critical, not for just the obvious reasons of how we deal with the coronavirus and how we get the economy started back up, but also how the Trump administration is really at some point going to have to pivot when the economy is started back up to the 100% mark, where everybody can go back to work and work at full speed to the extent that there is a job to go back to. But the Trump administration is going to pivot and then go after China and basically say, look, here is a huge speech. I'm going to give this speech. It's going to set American policy moving forward. I think that would happen. Sadly, it's not going to happen until the State of the Union speech next year, in which case he may or may not be president.
He may or not be the one coming in.
And I'm not really sure the next guy that comes in is going to have that same commitment to the American people to bring jobs back and to essentially say we're no longer going to allow the supply chain to be dependent upon China.
Yeah, I mean, we're really talking about the next great, international enemy, and I'd be
without question.
Look, I would be, rest assured. Do I have a preference between a Republican and a Democrat? Absolutely. Would I be comfortable if it was a Democrat who I could trust to be, stern with China? And believe me, there were some in the primaries that when you listen to them talk about China, you at least understood that they got it. But the person that we're potentially talking about, I am nervous about how he would respond in international affairs to a country like China.
Well, because he may be the president, the next president, if it's a Joe Biden, as an example, he could be a puppet of all of his donors, because he has shown throughout his lifetime that he's willing to sell out America. I mean, he talks the great talk. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from a working class town and all that stuff. All that is true. But you know what's not true? What's not true
record.
Is his true understanding of what his policies in a lifetime of public office have done to middle America and industrial America, namely Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin,
Illinois,
Rust Belt states,
Indiana,
the
working
Rust
belt,
states,
the Cotton
Ohio.
Belt, things like that, yeah.
They've destroyed them. So next up, a Harvard professor, Elizabeth Bartholet, wants a presumptive ban on homeschooling. Gotta say that again. Elizabeth Bartholet, she's a Harvard professor. She wants to ban homeschooling. She's not a political official, by the way. She's not an elected
a professor
official.
at Harvard.
She's just a professor, right? Which is
at Harvard, though. I mean,
Harvard.
This is where we're supposed to be training, our brightest young minds, and to send them out into the world to be, our future leaders, ambassadors, presidents, et cetera, et cetera.
And this was during a symposium that just occurred not long ago, just a few weeks ago, at Harvard University about homeschooling. And her final analysis was that we should probably not allow it.
Yeah.
We, the United States, we the people. And why do you think they had this? Well, I'm sure it's in part because all across America, parents have their children at home.
Homeschool them.
And the children are being effectively homeschooled. Yes, the teachers are communicating with them online. They're submitting all of perhaps they're taking online quizzes and tests, that they're communicating with their fellow students and with the teachers and so forth. It's not obviously exactly the same as being in the classroom, but the fact of the matter is that your parents are still there, making sure you are sitting at that table, which I can imagine probably is miserable.
Generally, you still have to pass all the state, standardized tests, and you have to pass, aptitude tests, and your entrance to college admissions are all the same.
And homeschooling has been increasing.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not saying it's increasing
by
exponential numbers, but it has nonetheless been increasing over the past few years.
What really dropped my jaw from her presentation was why she thought we had the power to get rid of homeschooling, is where she effectively said that the state gives parents the agency to be considered parents, and you're only deemed a parent because the state says you are, and you have that right, and that she thinks that at any time the state can revoke that right, and therefore you have no right to effectively homeschool your child because and to me the logical conclusion I'm drawing from that is because it's really not your child unless the state says it's your child.
Absolutely. And by the way, that's really well said, because she said, as one of her conclusions, Professor Bartholet of Harvard University, the lady that wants to ban homeschooling in America, she said that if parents want permission to opt out of public schools, the burden of those parents proving their case falls on the parents. So the parent would have to prove their case of why they're taking their kids out of the public school system and choosing to homeschool. I mean, there's something wrong with this person. Who on earth? Because the next thing would be, well, the burden is on you to say that you're going to send your kid to private school or to a charter school. The burden is on you to prove that.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, you and I are here obviously on a certain side of the table in this argument. Our belief is that it's the state's, obligation to, prove to you any action. Yes, you have to prove to me that my child should go to public school. Because, I mean, think about it from the logical standpoint of when, I have not personally been in this experience, but this is things that I've heard from talking to various different individuals, is when you buy a house, Mark, right? You don't go to any public school. You look for the public school that's best for your children. You shop around. You have an agency to it. And you kind of, I think, take this into perspective, and she has kind of just gone over that line. She's saying that effectively, I would say that her next general conclusion would be that you're all just kind of required to go to an equal-sized public school and that everything should be basically collectivized and equal throughout. And it's just, to me, it's absurd.
Isn't it funny that a professor from Harvard thinks that she is almighty and she's like the almighty God and gets to determine, what and how children learn.
Yeah.
And
that somehow,
there are different styles of learning. There are different philosophies about learning.
Think about all the, to me, it's just, she's acting like the school system is broken and that homeschooling and private schooling is terrible and that, public school has been the catalyst for the race to technology. And to me, it's just like, if you look at history, I mean, we've been doing private schooling, homeschooling, learning in various different ways for thousands of years. And somehow today we've come to this conclusion that it's all been wrong. To me, it's just...
I'm actually hoping, and believe me, I have my fingers crossed, I'm actually hoping across America that the students, since they're home, and no matter if they're homeschooled, and in fact, as we said, they're kind of being homeschooled even though they might be in public school because they're stuck at home, they're being quarantined. I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for those students to just pick up a book, put the computer down, pick up an actual book, and read it, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and just read it.
Yeah.
And get knowledge, obtain knowledge and new ways of thinking that way, instead of the force-fed education system that we have in so many parts of the country, public education system, whereby it's just, there's one way of learning, it's made for the middle, it's not made for exceptional children, it's not really helpful for others. It's just, kind of one size fits all education. I'm hoping that just picking up that book will make a difference.
Let me give you the millennial who went to a public school perspective here.
That must be you.
That must be me.
You went to public school in New Jersey.
I did go to public school in 82. We'll talk about it every time.
82 is not Trenton, right?
No.
Okay.
Jersey Shore.
Jersey Shore.
Tom's River,
oh,
Seaside Heights.
Jersey Shore. Jeez.
Yes, great show. No, I kid. I hate that show. That's another topic of discussion, maybe for another podcast. Anyway, so the point being is, I went to public school and I graduated, and never once did I feel that
Glad you graduated.
It was the never once did I feel that it was the penultimate way to be educated, and that anybody in any other way of education got a better or worse education than I did. And I think it is all relative to the individual who is learning, what their desires are to learn.
Sure.
You can put a kid in a homeschool and he can be a genius. You can put a kid in a private school and he can be a genius. And there's kids in public schools and they can be geniuses too. But it's all about, nurturing education in the proper way, where you want to, encourage children to learn and to, explore what makes them the happiest. Like,
sure.
Look, I have, topics that I personally like better than others, and that's synonymous anywhere else.
All of us have subject matters that we enjoy more than others.
And
sure.
It's just when you hear things like this, it's like, that this is the only way that anybody should ever learn it. It's the only option, and that it's a one-size-fits-all policy.
It's ridiculous.
To me, it falls so short of the realities on the ground. And this is what happens when you get these, philosopher kings, people that think that they're
Plato, very Platonic.
You get these philosopher kings who think that they think these great ideas, and that because they thought about it in their study, that it's somehow based in some abject truth on the ground.
Good old Elizabeth Bartholet of Harvard University, the Harvard professor. She's the one that thinks that you don't have the right to teach your children at home. And I just to conclude on that particular subject matter, I think she's out of her mind.
I agree.
And I can't imagine why Harvard would give someone like this an opportunity to say that the only way to be educated is the Harvard way. Well, I mean, that is so un-American. That is so anti-democratic.
I would agree on the premise that it's un-American and anti-democratic, but I actually kind of enjoy that, there are people out there who say these things, because it gives you and I and people across America the chance to sit down and debate it and,
how crazy
and assess about, the policy and things like that. And then hopefully we all come to the conclusion that is actually a horrible idea.
So in Oregon, they had a public service announcement.
Yes.
And their public service announcement was probably, I think, the dumbest public service announcement in America so far during the pandemic. And of course, we have the dumbest bill, and that's coming up soon. But the dumbest public service announcement, PSA, is in Oregon. And they said, quote, "Have you accidentally killed someone today?"
Oof.
And their point is that during the pandemic, if you left home and you went out, you may have accidentally killed someone today, even though you show no signs of having coronavirus and never have. But the fact that you would just go out, you may have accidentally killed someone. So that's what they put out there. Have you accidentally killed someone today? In other words, if you want to get back to work so you can feed your family and keep a roof over your head, then you're a murderer. Right? You're the murderer. And the state knows best.
It's a little fear-mongering. I've seen some great, because these are the things that flash over the overpasses and on the electric boards. I've seen some funny ones. I've seen some good ones. And most of the time you drive by them and you see them and you kind of chuckle a little bit, and it rings true a little bit, especially with some of the fun DUI ones you've seen. But man, to come out here and say, have you actually killed somebody?
Have you killed someone today because you left your house to buy food, or you went back to work?
Goodness.
You may have killed someone. And by the way, another crazy talk thing that's happened in the United States is many states are banning car washes. And by car washes, I don't mean the car wash where you go up and they vacuum the inside of your car, or the self-help car wash where you wash the outside and vacuum. Not those. I'm talking about the car washes that are fully automated. You stay in your car, you never get out.
I don't even know what the problem with the other ones are.
You go into the car wash, and you don't have inside service for your car by an attendant. You just go through a car wash where the car wash, it's all automated. It washes your car and you leave.
You pay and you leave. Yeah.
And they've been essentially closed because, well, they're closed because they're not essential businesses in many states. And what I thought, just thinking out loud, is if you park at your local grocery store because you want to go food shopping,
doing the same
someone
thing.
Walks by your car while you're inside, they sneeze. They indeed have coronavirus. It goes over your car, apparently lives on surfaces for quite some time. You then, touch some part of your car. Now you have it on your hands. I think that actually it makes sense to keep car washes open, especially the automated ones. But this is the kind of crazy stuff that's going on. And Bill Barr, of course, the Attorney General of the United States, has basically said he's going to join cases when governors overstep their bounds. He will consider taking legal action against governors who continue to impose stringent rules for dealing with the coronavirus that infringe upon constitutional rights. and even after the crisis subsides in their states. In other words, some of these governors might continue this after the peak of the crisis is over. They might continue to keep these powers that they have by closing certain kinds of businesses. But a car wash, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you mentioned the other ones as if you kind of understood their exception. I don't think that's true. But I don't think that really there should be any reason that businesses in general, I don't think the state should be in the habit of picking winners and losers. And when we're talking about things like car washes and what's a non-essential and an essential business, you're kind of getting at that because, you can go to a liquor store and you can buy liquor, but you can't go to a bookstore and buy a book, or you can go and, I can go wash my car outside by myself, but I can't pay somebody for a better, apparatus to do it in. And to me, it doesn't make sense.
And to be fair, Garrick, there are a lot of businesses that were not considered essential that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because you could social distance, you could allow a certain amount of people in at a time. We've talked about this before. I just brought the car wash thing up because it just seems so stupid.
It embodies the issue we're talking about.
It does. It really does. And the thing is a lot of governors and a lot of mayors are using this opportunity, this crisis, as an opportunity to impose kind of new crazy things like the car wash ban during the pandemic. But also, there's a city in America that has decided, and I really need the millennial opinion on this. There's a city in America that has a plan to put surveillance planes in the air to surveil the city and watch whether or not a crime is being committed. In other words, instead of putting a helicopter in the air because someone has just robbed a bank,
They're going to be up monitoring all the time.
These planes are up all the time, so it's almost like a thought crime.
Yeah.
In 1984, it's like, well, we know someone's going to commit a crime.
Let's go find them.
So therefore, we're going to keep the planes in the air all the time to surveil every single individual in the city.
They've been doing that in New Jersey with drones too, where they've basically been sending drones up in the air looking for people who aren't social distancing.
They're not social distancing, and right. And by the way, this is Baltimore City that's doing this. It's the Baltimore City Police Department. And U.S. District Judge Richard Bennett ruled that camera-equipped airplanes over Baltimore City do not violate privacy rights of city residents. He allowed a trial run of the flights to proceed. Quite honestly, this is where I put my foot down. I think that's disgusting. I think the judge is way off on this. I think there's no probable cause to put a plane in the air over top of a city that's majority minority, wouldn't matter what color the residents are, but in this case it's majority minority, and saying, well, because it's Baltimore, lots of crimes are going to be committed. Doesn't matter whether there is historical evidence that there are a lot of crimes in that city. What matters is you're definitely violating people's privacy rights by surveilling them all the time, 24/7.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it accomplishes the policy goals that people are setting out to put it in for. I mean, to me,
What's
it just
the millennial
sounds
opinion?
like it's just going to support the high school to prison pipeline. I mean, basically, you're going out looking for people to commit crimes and locking them up. It's not addressing any of the underlying crime conditions.
But millennials, you're going to be dealing with this for the rest of your lives.
Yeah.
This kind of overreach of government, and then doing it, by the way, during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Right? During a pandemic.
It's amazing when all these controversial things happen when people's attentions are placed otherwise.
It's like we've had this technology for a while, but now we're going to use it during a pandemic. Why? Because, and by the way, the Baltimore City Police Office did not say they're going to do it because of they're trying to locate people with coronavirus. Not sure how they would do that anyway. Instead, they're doing it because they're assuming that lots of people are going to be committing crimes or will commit a crime, and therefore are going to surveil every single individual in the city.
I think it
so
just
everybody's equally guilty.
It just breeds mistrust. It further, I believe, divides the people who are policed and the police themselves. And
it does. Agreed.
It's just a bad idea.
So get this. Podcast listeners, Nancy Pelosi just came out and endorsed Joe Biden, finally.
Yes.
And I got to tell you, she looks more plastic than ever. I think that she was airbrushed. Our assistant producer, Chris Hopkins, says, I think she was airbrushed in this picture because she does look like a Barbie doll. I mean, that there's no imperfection. And Nancy's not a young lady, so either she just had new plastic surgery or they airbrushed her face. And it didn't look like she was talking out of one side of her mouth like she usually is, and looked like all of her brain was working, but that's probably because she had naturally
laying it on thick,
cue cards. Yeah, I have to. Well, because she can't usually put a sentence together. This time she obviously had a script that she was reading from a screen. Well, we have her endorsement of Joe Biden, and we have to play this because this is news. Here it is.
Today, I am proud to endorse Joe Biden for President of the United States because he will be an extraordinary president. He knows how to get the job done. When our nation faced the Great Recession, it was Joe Biden who led the implementation and the accountability of the Recovery Act, helping create and save millions of jobs. When the Democratic Congress was passing the Affordable Care Act, Joe Biden was a partner for progress in the White House and also championed the cancer moonshot. When the Trump administration launched its campaign to destroy every last benefit and protection of the ACA, Joe Biden has been with us every step of the way to protect Americans' quality, affordable health care. And as we face coronavirus, Joe has been a voice of reason and resilience with a clear path to lead us out of this crisis.
Yes, Joe is going to lead us out of the pandemic because he has so much experience. But I also heard her say something about mooning. What did she say?
The cancer moonshot.
Okay. I thought she said Joe has mooned the. I don't know.
It was a initiative where Joe Biden went.
He probably did. Chris said he probably did moon the country. Yes. Well.
Yeah.
After he sniffed someone, I'm sure. But yeah, that's the Nancy Pelosi endorsement, and really, I mean, she looks too perfect, so a lot of work was done on this before it was released.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It seemed like an inevitable point where she was going to come out and endorse him. I'll tell you what, though.
Of course she has to endorse him. She has to.
But what a, it's just...
The whole election's going to be about the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, the entire election.
Usually, though, with endorsements, they're supposed to give you some, wind in your sails and stuff. What a time to be doing endorsements. I feel like, we're here talking about it, and everybody's just like, oh, here's my video endorsement for this person and that person, and campaigning is being done on the web.
Wouldn't it be fun to do a spoof endorsement of him, just generally speaking, about his sniffing people's back hair and
I'm sure there's some good ones on the internet we got to find.
And all of his idiotic comments that, just make no sense.
Yeah, and it's amazing because, here we are 2 weeks later, right? And still not a mention I think her name is Tara Reid, the accuser of Joe Biden.
Yes.
And, people are going on the offensive telling her that, she's desperate and how could she do things like this?
Yeah, how could she, because he's a Democrat, how can you possibly come forward? So,
yeah.
Well, next up, we have the dumbest bill in America. Yes, it's the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up to the dumbest bill in America, Mr. Assistant Producer? Of
course.
Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it is really dumb. So the dumbest bill in America is H.R. 6515 in the United States House of Representatives by none other than Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman from Minnesota. And Ilhan Omar wants to take advantage of the pandemic by basically legally expropriating property. So we're calling this the Pandemic Expropriation Bill. She calls it the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. And so her idea is that it sounds good initially, folks, so you got to hear me out on this. Her idea with the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which we're calling pandemic expropriation, is that you don't have to pay your rent or mortgage during the pandemic, at least until the crisis is over, which, by the way, could be a year before the crisis is over because naturally we may not be back to full employment until that time. And so it's really squishy when the crisis would be over. You wouldn't have to pay your rent or your mortgage. And in addition to that, if you were a landlord, for example, and you engaged and became part of this program, once the program was over, you would have to give 10% of your property equity to all of your tenants. In other words, she's trying to socialize property ownership. She's trying to create a socialist society so there is no property ownership in the United States, and using the pandemic to do that, which is why we're calling it pandemic expropriation. We have our first clip of her talking about this particular bill, the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, and here is Ilhan Omar.
We know right now, really, there isn't a set timeline when we expect for Congress to be back and to take on the next relief package. We think it might happen in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And so that actually gives us an opportunity to push for this, because in 2 weeks there's another rent that is due.
Yeah, so there you have it. So she's talking about her bill and, talking it up. And of course, it really sounds good during a pandemic. And by the way, we want people to understand out there in podcast land. I know a lot of people personally who can't afford to pay their mortgages because they've been laid off, or their job has been terminated because it doesn't exist anymore, because the company has closed. I know people that can't pay their rent. It's an awful thing. She's trying to take advantage of the entire country by passing a national law to say, well, we're not going to just help you during this crisis. We're going to force common ownership of real property. Common ownership. So one of the things is you have to, if you take the money and your landlord, 10% of your equity goes to the tenants. And if you take the money as a landlord and the government, you can't discriminate against source of income. And by the way, for the podcast listeners, that means that if you were in Section 8 housing as a landlord, you have to receive and accept Section 8 housing. Well, what if you don't want to? It's your property, right? So remember, it's your property, and you're being forced to say the government is my customer, because that's who's paying you. The government really is the tenant. Right? And that is forcing socialized ownership of real property, which is really a scary thing.
Yeah.
And get this, you also have to permanently reserve a portion of your rent restricted units for lower income households. And among other many, you have to agree to provide residents. Get this, you have to agree to provide residents in your housing units that you're renting. Doesn't matter if, large, medium, small. You have to provide services such as health care, employment, education, assistance, childcare, financial literacy class, and other community-based support services. What does that have to do with being a landlord?
Oof.
I mean, the bill does so much. By the way, podcast listeners, I could go on and on and on about the crazy amount of this bill. So here's the problem with bills. It always sounds really good because any politician can make a bill sound wonderful on the surface until you read the fine print, which, by the way, almost no one ever does. They almost never actually read the entire bill to see what could go wrong with this. When you say to people, you don't have to pay your rent, you have to pay your mortgage.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're going to own part of the man's property when all this is over.
Yeah, I want to address this from my perspective from 2 points. I want to separate the bill because I think it does two things. The first part is the most on your face part. Is basically saying you don't have to pay your rent or your mortgage during this time of crisis. I think that is, again, categorically unuseful to fixing the economy. There are a lot of people whose lives, despite having to stay home every day, have not been significantly impacted. They're still getting their paychecks, they're still making the same amount of money, they still have the same amount of people in their household because they're still employed.
Yes.
If you can pay your bills, pay your bills.
That group of people, well said, and I'm just going to interrupt you temporarily. That group of people, well said.
Yes.
That group of people that have been unaffected by this pandemic financially should continue to pay their bills.
Yes.
She's encouraging them not to. Good.
Now, second, for the people who can't pay their bills, you should. I would see some sympathy here in that I think that there should be more done during this time to work with tenants and people with mortgages to kind of create a way for them to come out even, right?
It's called forbearance.
Yeah, basically you take that month and you put it at the end of the lease and you extend the terms of your mortgage or your lease.
Yes.
I think that most mortgage agencies, I know that they're doing this for all FHA backed mortgages and rents, which is about 70%, but there's a 30% who are kind of left out on that. And I think the onus should be on those companies to step up to the plate and help people during this time. Now, that's the first half of the bill that really struck me. But the second half, where we're talking about forced collectivization of property, is absurd.
It's the beginning of forced
collectivization.
It's basically
my property owner, my tenant, goes out, they develop a project, they build a house, and I have the, basic exchange that I give them capital, and in exchange they let me stay in their room. But somehow this bill will basically say that because I have exchanged capital for that house, that I am now an integral part of the working, structure of this business, and so I'm entitled to capital and equity as a result. And that's where you lose me, because it just goes against all the principles of free market capitalism and economics that we've all, known that has made us this great, powerful economic nation. And
so look, I have to say this. I come from a generation, I'm a baby boomer, as you all know, out there in podcast land. I come from a generation where when there is a deep recession, when there is a crisis like this, and this is more deep depression, this is more depression or deep recession like, no doubt about it, this pandemic and what it's causing and wreaking havoc on people's lives. I come from a generation where when you owe rent, you go talk to the landlord. The first place you go isn't to government. The first place you go is to the person with whom you have the deal and the relationship. And so here's an example. So I know a ton of people who have small stores, small businesses, and they rent the building that they're in. And they own the business. So the business is in the building, they own the business, but they rent the building. And they have gone to the landlord and said, hey, look, I know I owe you this huge chunk of change for the month of March and the month of April, but is there a way we can do a workout whereby that additional rent can be deferred until at the end of the lease? And the end of the lease might be 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years down, or moving forward, can I have, this
Can I disperse this month over the course of the next 24 payments?
Or months, right? Maybe I might even need 3 months assistance. And but that workout is between you and the landlord, and a good landlord will understand that he is not going to have anyone coming in behind you.
Yeah, exactly, because that incentivizes good land ownership. People who are stewards for their tenants and helpful.
It's also people treating people good, in a good way.
Because if I see somebody who's quick to throw out their tenants at some strip mall, why would I want to be there? Why would I want to put my business in that place? Why would I want to support that 100%. Person who's greedy?
I would never go there.
No.
And by the way, I've also heard of landlords who have, and I know someone, they're very close to me, they went to the landlord and they talked to the landlord about reduction in rent, and the landlord said, nope.
So then they got
it. You signed it, and that's the way it is. And you know what? Here's the thing. There's always payback for these type of people. I believe in karma. That individual, one day, and this person wasn't interested in getting something for nothing. They just wanted to defer it. So the United States government, the government does not belong between you and the mortgage company and you and your landlord. You need to negotiate that because, we're all adults, and good people, when they're negotiating honestly and they're doing so in a transparent way, can always come to an arrangement much faster and much more equitable than the United States government getting in between you and that other person.
Just think about all the paperwork you have to fill out, all the hoops you got to jump through, the qualifications and the regulations. And
what's really amazing too, Garrick, as you being our one millennial today, is this podcast is about communist bullies. And Ilhan Omar, she's all about socialism and communism. She's actually quite frightening. We have a clip from her last year talking to Elliot Abrams, and she's actually grilling him. And I believe it's the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And Elliot Abrams is the special envoy to Venezuela. This was last year when she did this.
And during the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, the first one, he was the special envoy to a couple of different countries, which she'll mention in the clip.
So he was the special envoy to Venezuela, of course, from the Trump administration. So Ilhan Omar is grilling him. This is a year ago. This will give you a flavor of who this person is who put in this dumbest bill. We have a clip on this, and you have to listen to it to believe it. And here it is.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Whether under your watch, a genocide will take place, and you will look the other way because American interests were being upheld, is a fair question.
So here she is on the side of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. So she, being Ilhan Omar, is on his side, the dictator's side, and the dictator, of course, being a socialist and a communist and allied with, of course, Cuba and others. And she's siding with him and saying, well, the United States, Mr. Abrams, is the problem, and you're the problem, sir. And meanwhile, this actual interview, if you will, during the hearing occurred right around when Maduro fixed the election.
Yes, this
and it was actually defeated.
During the initial, it was basically a revolution or a civil war going on within the country with the Guaido regime.
He lost the election.
The Maduro regime.
And they wouldn't let Juan Guaido, who won the election, gain power because that's what naturally communists, socialists, and dictators do. This is the same woman that put in this bill that I call the Pandemic Expropriation Bill, H.R. 6515, which is the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which would open the door to socialized property ownership.
Yeah.
And getting the government involved.
It's
I want
terrible.
some final thoughts on this.
My final thought, I want to address the clip where she's grilling Elliot Abrams.
Please.
I think to conflate the people in Venezuela seeking a democratic country and freedom and democracy in the wake of authoritarianism and communism as her equating that to some genocidal regime is inappropriate.
Incredibly inappropriate. And if anything, she's a communist bully herself. And I believe, in my heart, believe me, I'm willing to go out there on a limb and say there's no doubt in my mind that she's a socialist and that she's a communist because she literally is on the side of all people, Nicolas Maduro, and then put in this horrible bill, which is our dumbest bill in America, H.R. 6515, Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. Good old Ilhan Omar. And that is the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. Thank you to our millennial, Garrick Ross, and of course, our producer, Adam Katora, our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.